So, Mr. Panzironi with Panzironi Explained, today we are going to talk about two important aspects of our metabolism. Let's go and find out about them, and we're going to talk about blood sugar and glycemic variability. What do you want to tell us?
Well, certainly blood sugar is a fundamental aspect of our metabolism, but I would venture to say the building block for understanding why we get sick from modern diseases. Too bad this element really official medicine never found it.
So just to find out what blood sugar is, let's go through this tutorial.
Blood sugar, from Greek glucose, sweet, and ima, blood, indicates the value of blood glucose concentration. Its value is expressed by the unit of measurement mg/dl, or milligram of glucose per deciliter of blood. The amount of basal glucose occurs between 65 mg/dl to 90 mg/dl. For an overall total in the human body of about 5 grams of glucose. The hormones that increase blood glucose are glucagon, which regulates the release of glucose from the liver, where we have a reserve of 70 grams of glycogen. Cortisol, called the stress hormone, and adrenaline stimulate liver glucose release and muscle protein catabolization. The only hormone that reduces blood glucose is insulin, which inhibits glucagon and via GLUT4 allows the uptake of blood glucose by muscle fibrocells and adipocytes. The only cells that use glucose in an exclusive form are neurons and erythrocytes.
So Panzironi, in this video we looked at basal blood glucose, which is basically that blood glucose that we find in our body at every hour of the day.
Yes, that gives us an understanding of this functioning of the body, that actually our metabolism is very careful to keep our blood sugar constant. Because while glucose is certainly an essential resource for our metabolism, however, its excess can even lead us to death. So this level must be kept constant at all times, because if it falls below 50 milligrams per deciliter, we go into a diabetic coma. But if it exceeds 500 milligrams per deciliter, in the same case, we die from it.
That's exactly why, to regulate our blood sugar, we have hormones. So there are hormones that raise it, like glucagon, cortisol, and adrenaline, and then we have one that lowers it, which is insulin.
Yes, it is very important, this concept, the fact that we understand precisely how hormones go to, let's say, move our blood sugar. However, I have to tell you that official medicine continues to make a very serious mistake. That is, it continues to believe that glycemic peace is induced by a power relationship between insulin and glucagon. This is actually not the case, because our bloodstream has this amount of glucose, and as our cells, the ones that use precisely glucose, such as neurons or erythrocytes, use it, on the other side we have an organ that is the liver, which has a strategic reserve of 70 grams, and through glucagon the amount of glucose that is taken away is restored. If we then have a greater need to raise blood sugar, two other hormones intervene, which is precisely adrenaline, the highest expression, or cortisol.
Wait, but then what role does insulin play in our metabolism?
It actually has a role of emergency. That is, it prevents us from dying precisely from a diabetic coma the moment we start eating foods that are too high in sugar. However, it is so efficient that it then induces a glycemic drop.
So basically it is as if insulin saves our lives every time we introduce a food that is too rich in sugar.
Well, sure, every time we eat a typical dish of the Mediterranean diet, so bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, and legumes, we introduce significant amounts of carbohydrates, and we don't die just because of this effect of insulin, which, however, induces a glycemic drop and begins to do us damage. So it is a hormone that our body has to dose very sparingly.
So the so-called Mediterranean diet, how much does it alter our glycemic homeostasis?
Absolutely, it disrupts it. But to make our home audience understand how this happens, the relationship precisely from the amount of glucose we have at basal level, what we instead introduce with an overly carbohydrate-rich diet, such as that of the Mediterranean diet, I thought, in short, to do a little experiment. A small example that might allow our home audience to better understand.
And indeed, magically, our Alessio appeared here. And let's go and see practically. Based on the different types of blood sugar, how many we have in our body, how many we could fit in. So let's start right away with basal blood sugar. So I ask our Alessio to put a sugar cube in front of the basal blood sugar label because that's what we have.
Yes, we have an amount of glucose that is precisely maximum 0.90 milligallons per deciliter. Calculating the number of precisely the number of liters of blood we have, we arrive at 5 grams. So exactly the size, the amount of glucose present in a sugar cube.
Perfect. So now instead I'm going to go and ask our always Alessio to put on the second tray the sugar cube that could induce diabetic coma. That is 6 sugar cubes. Doing a quick calculation, a sugar cube is about 6 grams.
Yes, we can practically see it visually. In short, we are really talking about very low amount of glucose, and if we exceed this threshold, we go into diabetic coma and die. And this shows the dangerousness of this nutrient.
So now I instead ask our Alessio to put on the third tray the sugar contained in an average meal planned for the diet. Mediterranean diet. Here he starts putting some, let's see how much he puts in. I already see that he put in 4 sugar cubes. 5 sugar cubes. So this is the sugar contained in an average meal of the Mediterranean diet. This is continuing to put in. Panzironi, here we are almost 10. How many are Alessio? Now 8, so far 8. He is continuing to put.
We have to move forward, obviously.
Panzironi, we don't have the whole evening. How many? How many grams are contained within an average meal of the Mediterranean diet? Grams of sugar?
Well, look, we are talking about a meal that is considered healthy by official medicine, by modern dietetics. That is a meal that is normally eaten by an Italian, let's say, who is very health conscious. So we are talking about 100 grams of pasta as a first course, a slice of bread accompanying a second course, and a piece of fruit. And this simple, let's say, meal reaches something like 150 grams of sugar. So we are basically talking about 30 sugar cubes times 5 is precisely 150.
So 30 lumps of sugar are contained within an average meal of the Mediterranean diet. However, you are always too good because you made a calculation, in my opinion, to take away, because normally then one does not eat the 100 grams of pasta. One eats. The Italian is very greedy. He always eats at 200 grams, or maybe at the end of the meal, or as a side dish, he adds a nice side of potatoes. So in short, it makes it a little bit more abundant in sugar and insulin carbohydrate.
But yes, certainly for the simple fact that we can't get full on this diet, that is the Mediterranean diet, we cannot do that because, of course, we then have glycemic dips that induce hunger. So either on the one hand, we go to increase the amount of carbohydrates at each meal so that we arrive full at the next meal, or evidently as the medicine advises us. Official, we go to intersperse breakfast of lunch and dinner with precisely smaller meals and therefore more carbohydrates. But let's say Alessio should add to calculate at least another 15 lumps of sugar, which is the amount of sugar we find in a meal perhaps made with 200 grams of pasta as the first course. Always the usual slice of bread and a piece of fruit, so a diet that is usually what people do at home. If not, they're not even using snacks that increase significantly also the consumption of carbohydrates during the same day. So if we see the amount of sugar, we are talking about absolutely abnormal amounts that cannot help but bring consequences for our health.
So in the meantime, let's see. Thanks to Alessio, how much sugar we introduce with the Mediterranean diet. Let's go and understand that obviously insulin stimulates glycemic variability. And just to understand what glycemic variability is, we did a tutorial.
Glycemic variability represents the frequency and amplitude of fluctuations in the average blood glucose. That is, it is measured by the glycemic peak following a carbohydrate meal and the subsequent insulin-induced glycemic drop. In fact, the blood glucose curve is measured in a graph where we find, on the ordinate, blood glucose as the base, 80 milligrams per deciliter, and in the abscissa, the elapsed time since food intake. Measuring the difference between the maximum peak and the minimum blood glucose level represents glycemic variability. As glycemic variability increases, oxidative damage increases, as shown in the following graph, where we find inordinate urinary excretion of auto-iso-PGF2-alpha, considered the gold standard for detecting excess lipid peroxidation, as the baseline. The mean amplitude of the glycemic excursion, normal glycemic variability following a meal on the Mediterranean diet, causes urinary excretion of 600 auto-iso-PGF2-alpha, Pg/mg, of creatinine.
So Panzironi, we have seen that glycemic variability induced by a simple meal of foods from the Mediterranean diet induces increased oxidative damage per se anyway.
Certainly, this is shown by so many studies that confirm precisely that following a simple meal of the Mediterranean diet, we first have a glycemic spike that comes to 140 ml per deciliter and then peak at 50 ml per deciliter. Well, this variability of 90 milligram per deciliter is regarded somewhat by current medicine as something normal, something inescapable, when in fact these studies show that a diet done in this way even allows a 500% increase in oxidation of, say, lipids, which today is considered as a gold standard to assess precisely the degree of oxidation of our body following a meal, as opposed to a diet that should be the healthy one, so based on meat, fish, and vegetables, so we are talking about 5 times the oxidation of our tissues and our body.
And this is reflected on the occurrence of all the oxidative diseases. I have in my hand your book, Living to 120, the research, where you just dedicated a chapter to glycemic variability. For example, on page 85, I read a study on the relationship between glycemic variability and diabetic neuropathy. There is another one that talks about variability with increased death from sepsis, another on relationship with development of liver fibrosis, another on bilirubin levels. Basically, there are many studies that confirm the danger of glycemic variability.
Look, I in my books brought more than 100. But actually, there are thousands of studies that make it very clear how glycemic variability is a real problem for our health. The real problem, however, is that the official medicine, the protocol medicine, the one, let's say, that absolutely wants rules at all costs, on the one hand recommends and continues to recommend a totally wrong diet, and on the other hand does not realize that its own scientists have discovered and confirmed that that diet they recommend is absolutely the most wrong.
Thanks to Adriano Panzironi for Panzironi and Explain Us.